Okay.
Fantastic. So if you share your desktop, I should be able to see it.
There we go.
Yay, excellent.
Whee!
It all works eventually.
It does all work. That's so great. I was stressed out of my mind there for a second.
It's just to keep us on our toes, I think, these things.
Yes, yes, which I don't mind entirely, but I'm glad it's working.
Yes, it's good to be reminded, isn't it?
Yes.
Great. And I can see that people are starting to join. So welcome. Thanks for joining us. Simon here from Red Giant. And we've got Chad Perkins also, of course. So we'll just give everyone a couple more minutes to log in, and then we'll kick off. And I'll repeat this during the intro, but we are recording this, and we'll send you out the link once it's finished. And if you've got any follow-up questions, please let us know, training@redgiant.com. And those emails, messages get to us, and so we can then reply, even if it's if you just want copies of the previous recordings from this week. And you can see people logging in, can't you, Chad? So you can see if there are any familiar names that have attended the previous sessions.
Yes, and there are. That's very nice. Welcome back, everybody.
Excellent. Yes, we really appreciate it. Thank you for spending time with us this week. And the plan is to make these techniques useful for you, so you can get a bit more out of the tools that you're already using. So if that's the case, then we're delighted. And in that little bubble where you see in the interface, you can ask questions or leave comments. So if it has been useful, then please let us know. We love hearing from you. And also, if this has solved the sorts of workflows and issues that you seem to be facing, because that was one of the plans with these sessions, to make sure that we answer some of those questions that are typically frequent, or those issues, which was one main theme, of course, which is doing stuff more quickly. I think that's always the theme, isn't it?
Yes. And hopefully when you're doing quicker things, you're doing like sexier things too. Like it's better looking than it was
Yes.
initially.
Quicker and sexier.
Yes.
Yes. Pick any two. You know that triangle, fast, good, and cheap. I've had many
Yes.
producers in my experience that say, pick all three, please.
Yeah, if only.
Yes, that's right. So officially, now we're at the top of the hour, welcome. I'm Simon Walker from Red Giant, and I'm delighted to welcome Chad Perkins, who is running these sessions this week. And as I mentioned on a couple of the previous webinars, Chad is a long-time user and trainer of the Trapcode tools and the other tools in the Red Giant catalog as well. And in fact, he's very experienced because as well as running multiple training sessions on multiple platforms like LinkedIn and Lynda and Udemy, he's also done multiple tutorials on the Red Giant site, and he's written the user guides for Trapcode Form. So you're learning from the right guy here. And I've been following Chad for a while now and learning from him. So I'm delighted for him to be able to sharing his experience. So thank you, Chad. And also another housekeeping question, we'll be recording this session and you'll get the link automatically. But if you don't, and if you've got any other questions, please keep in contact with us, training@redgiant.com, and we can provide resources. And I believe, Chad, you're planning to do a follow-up small project file of some of the things you've been showing that we can share out too.
Yes, yes, the project file will be ready for sharing for like a little bit, but yeah, absolutely, I want to get that ready and be able to like consolidate it and send it out for sure.
Fantastic. We had a couple of requests during this week for people who would be keen to be able to seeing that. So I just thought I'd mention this to everyone. If you would like project file, let us know, training@redgiant.com. Great. So over to you, Chad. You're kind of following up a little bit from the sessions this week, but also introducing some new stuff, aren't you?
That is absolutely correct. And also, thank you for the glowing and very liberal introduction. I appreciate that. It's hard to follow that because I'm just like a regular guy that messes up and does dumb stuff all the time too. So day one, we've been working on user interface stuff this week. And day one, we had this kind of like mock user interface where we created all these elements, and we had the premise was that we're like alerting spies to let them know that like, hey, we've got a threat. And then yesterday we were kind of like, all right, we have more information about the threats. We're trying to get these spies to take this seriously, and they're not. So today we're going to use primarily the VFX suite to kind of show some spies exactly what could go on if they don't take this threat seriously enough. So we're going to say, phase one is an EMP, an electromagnetic pulse bomb, which I've never experienced in my life, but apparently, if you are a terrorist on a TV show, that's what you do. You set off one of those things. And so we're going to create this with chromatic displacement, and there's some really beautiful things happening here with like the text. There's some cool stuff that we're going to get into there. And then after that, because of the EMP, there's going to be phase two of this. If we don't catch this bad guy, is going to be destruction. So we're going to look at some fire here and how to composite that using super comp. And then after the destruction, phase three is just pure chaos. So we're going to be adding to this and playing around with this and using a bunch of really cool tools. And there's actually a lot happening behind the scenes that doesn't really show up here that we're going to be getting into. We're going to be hitting all of the red giant high notes. We're going to be in the Trapcode Suite a little bit. We're going to be in Universe. We're going to be in the VFX Suite. We're even going to dabble into the Magic Bullet Suite a little bit and color this a little bit and make it better. This is going to be fun. Hopefully, this will be a great send off, a good finale for you. So here's our our humble starting point. We have this footage that just doesn't look, I don't know, doesn't look that amazing. And also too, like there's this sign here on this building, and I want to get rid of it. And I only did this once just because I didn't want to take the time to do this all throughout the project, but the same technique can be used to clean up all kinds of blemishes, problems, whatever. And it's using something called the spot clone tracker. So we're going to remove this text that really stands out, this big sign. And no offense to the Wardian people, I'm sure they're great people and have a great company. But we're going to remove this logo to clean things up a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my background layer. I'm going to apply the spot clone tracker. And what this does is that it creates kind of like this cloning workflow, which is really cool. Now, there is cloning inherently in After Effects. There is a clone stamp tool, but it's not that great for me. Like, I don't like using it because you have to track the clone thing that you're cloning, and you have to track where you're cloning from, and like the connection between them isn't that obvious, and then you don't get these cool interface. So um, the good people at Red Giant have also felt that way apparently, because now we have the spot clone tracker, which tracks for you and clones in one fell swoop, and it's super convenient. And this interface is really nice here. It's very obvious what's going on here, or it's kind of obvious. It's intuitive anyways. There's a blue circle that's like saying, okay, we're taking data from here, and there's an arrow, and we're putting it here. So it's taking data from this spot and putting it here to fix it. Now, even before we get started, we could learn a little bit about this by what's going on. Actually, let me go ahead and do this. This will make it more clear. So you can see here that it's taking the texture from this building and putting it right here. But notice that this is much brighter and a totally different set of colors than what we have here. So it's not only just taking the data like in a dumb way, it's taking the data and intelligently blending it into the color and lighting information of the destination. So this is a phenomenal tool for any kind of like cosmetic cleanup, as well as this kind of like less intelligent blemish removal type stuff. So these are linked inherently. So if I move the destination thingy, then the source thingy comes along for the ride as well. So what I want to do is I'm going to bring that closer, and then I could move the orange destination thing over a little bit, and I could zoom in closely here, and I'm going to do this. And what I want to do is move this so it's just over that sign. So I can click these little points here and resize this to kind of make sure that we're only getting that sign, which is really cool. I like the flexibility of these little dilly bobbers. They're fun to play with. And I could then move this up, get this into position how I like it. And for some reason, this doesn't make sense to me geographically, but when I've played around with this example, somehow there seems to be a rotation difference in this. So like this is like off from this rotation wise, but we could come over here to spot rotate and I could rotate this ever so slightly and get that into position, which is really cool. I'm going to move this over a little bit more. Maybe I need to make this wider again because I'm seeing the edge of the sign here. And I don't want to take too long trying to get this perfect because, you know, there are bigger fish to fry with this example, but this is pretty cool. And yeah, it's off a little bit here, but we're just going to let it ride for now. And I'm going to go to the Swat clone tracker and I'm going to track it backwards because I'm at the last frame like a bonehead. So I'm going to go ahead and track that backwards. And while it's tracking, you can see what's going on here. It would go faster if we turned these layers off so that After Effects didn't have to see all the things that were happening and load those frames up visually. But I forgot to do that. So this is going to take just a hair longer than
Here's a little tip for you, by the way. This is something
okay.
I discovered just recently. You know, you're zoomed in at 400% here.
Yes.
Spot Clone Tracker actually tracks more quickly when you're at 100% because it doesn't
Really?
have to zoom in and load. Yes, it doesn't have to zoom in and load an extra bit, the extra interface, and then have that as an extra overlay.
Oh, awesome.
So, but
Well
that's
then,
something worth just worth sharing to everyone.
well, I'm glad I botched that up then. That's great. It was worth that tip. Thank you, Simon.
Not
I
at all,
appreciate
because
that.
it's caught me out a while for a few times, and I've just been playing with it, and I realized that it processes faster when you can see the whole image. But just for what it's worth.
Awesome. Thank you. That's phenomenal. Um, so it's done tracking. Thank you again, Simon, for that. And what's cool about this is that there are keyframes set up for this orange spot. That's the thing that's tracked, but the blue thing doesn't have that. So like the source material. So if I look at it after tracking and I'm like, you know what? I think I do want to move that over just a tad. It's fine and it's fixed and I don't have to mess with it anymore. It doesn't reckon any keyframes or whatever. So it's not like locked in. Only the orange thing is tracked. So now if I zoom in to 100%, well, then you can see my error a little bit, how that's not totally lined up. But the track is great, and this blemish is cleaned up. That sign is taken out, and that looks pretty amazing. So pretty cool stuff. Okay, so now let's apply our friend Optical Glow here to this text. And actually, since we've been doing that all week, and we're going to be doing that a lot more in this session, I've already just gone ahead and applied that here. And what we're going to do now is, well, let's colorize this footage first. This is kind of drab looking footage, especially compared to like this thing. You know, this is intimidating. This is going to get some spies to get off their butts and do some spy work, but this is not going to scare anybody. So what we need to do is color correct this, and I'm going to do this really quickly. Again, dipping into the Magic Bullet Suite, we're going to use something called Mojo for that. And I've created some curves here just to give it like a basic contrast, but Mojo is really the thing that's going to make this sexy. So I'm going to apply Mojo 2. And what Mojo does is it attempts to separate the highlights from the shadows by adding kind of a cinematic color grade, which typically warms the highlights and cools the shadows, which separates them quite a bit. I'm going to take off this text and I'm going to zoom in here because this building right here is like a Mojo commercial waiting to happen because this side of the building is getting lit by the sun and this side is not, so it's in shadow. So as we have the before, we have kind of like a more neutral color thing going down between them. But as we add Mojo, we definitely can see that this side is warmed and this side is cooled. So that's kind of what's going on. So I can increase the effect by increasing the Mojo value. I could increase the contrast by increasing the punch it. I could wash this out and make it seem more intense by adding contrast and bleaching it, taking away a little bit of the saturation. I could fade this. I can squeeze the blue tones together. I could squeeze the skin tones together. I'm going to increase the vignette, which adds that cool darkness on the edges, which is cool. I could go into corrections and fiddle with this a little bit more. I might take down the exposure a little bit, just the whole deal. There's also a cool warm slider. So if I take this to a negative value, it cools everything. It takes it to a positive value. It warms everything. And for some reason, cool just feels more relaxing to me in this case. So I'm going to take it to a faint positive value. And then what you can do is go down to the strength value, which is kind of like an opacity value for all of Mojo. I'm just going to tone this down a little bit to like 80 or so. So here's before Mojo and after. Definitely a lot more cinematic and much more in the neck of the woods of what we're going for as far as the tone goes. Okay, so we're going to create this electromagnetic pulse, and this is a fun one. We're going to use something called chromatic displacement for this. This is a new effect in the VFX Suite. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you this map that I already made. I made a pre-comp using radio waves, good old radio waves, decades old radio waves, just doing this. And this is our deal, our map that we're going to use to displace the other layer. But I want this to be a little bit more irregular. And so what I did is I use an effect called Ecto that's in Universe. And let me just show you what it is. I kind of tweaked it so that it's a better fit for our displacement map, but not as sexy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply Ecto and show you what this thing can do. So already right off the bat, you can see the magic here. So if I play this, like all of a sudden, regular old radio waves is now pretty awesome ecto radio waves. And so we see like all this animation along the edges. There's some like distortion. It feels like it's kind of like rippling through maybe like a fractal field or something like that because the distortion is changing over time. I mean, that's pretty cool stuff. And we can increase the distortion if we want more irregularity in our circles, which is pretty cool. We could also open up something like distortion settings and see that there's actually different patterns being used here for the distortion. So there's clouds right now. We could change this to plasma, get a totally different effect, change it to electric, change it to brimstone. So some pretty awesome stuff going down here with Ecto. It's a really fun effect. And we have all these like little like cool energy things coming off of the edges. So if you want to apply it to text or simple line art, it just instantly kind of creates this ectoplasm thing that would be at home in a Ghostbusters promo. And now I went through previously and fiddled with this. And again, it's not nearly as sexy. I took all the glow off so that there's less of a spread to this and it's a little bit more narrow. But this is what we're going to use for the displacement map. So basically, looks like that. A lot of complexity, a lot of irregularity, and it feels organic. And it's just radio waves and ecto, just boom, with no keyframes and very, very little work on my part, which I always appreciate. Okay, so we're going to go back here to our phase one start. And what I'm going to do is I could apply the chromatic displacement anywhere. I could apply it to our base layer, but what I'm going to do is actually apply it to an adjustment layer. So I'm going to turn on my adjustment layer and I'm going to apply chromatic displacement. Got to spell it right though. We're going to use that. Okay, there we go. So now I'm going to change the displacement layer to the pre-comp ripples. And by the way, I made this gray because if you make it 50% gray, it won't change the displacement map at all. You can also do this transparent. You can do it with the black background, but sometimes with the black background, especially, things can shift a little bit. And so gray just makes sure that like I don't have to worry about it shifting. Also, it takes 2 seconds to make like a gray solid. So boom, there you go. So, okay, so what I want to do here is I need to use the ripples map, which I'm doing, but I need to add some displacement. So I'm going to take this up to like, let's say 5. And so already you could see what's going on here. And you also you could see the ectoness carry over. You could see the irregularity in those radio waves and making this a little bit more organic, which is pretty cool. Now, a lot of visual effects like in After Effects or whatever, like plugin or whatever, the settings can be a little bit over the top initially. And this can be helpful because you want to be able to see what the effect is doing. So oftentimes I'll use ridiculous settings just to dial in what I want. and then tone it back down to make it fit with the project. And so we kind of want to dial this back a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to soften the displacement layer so that there's less intense of an effect. And this is much more subtle and maybe harder to see via a webinar. So I am going to crank this up and overdo it a little bit, but just want to show you that difference. And also, I want to talk about these two options right here. This is really where the magic is in the displace spread and the spread chroma. So the displace spread refers to like how much of the pixels around the displacement are displaced. So if I crank this up to, I'm just going to jump up to 100, you could see that these values are spread out around the displacement. And that's a pretty cool effect. Another thing is here, and the reason why it's called chromatic displacement is that we are displacing the chroma, and so we're staggering the color channel, so we get a little bit of like chromatic aberration along the edges of the displacement, and that's a really, really cool look. I love that. Now, if you don't like that and you just want to distort something as is, you can take the spread chroma value down to 0, and then we're just using the colors that are there. But what a big difference, right? I'm going to undo that, and you can see the split in color channels, and it's just such a just gorgeous look. I love that. So now with this, I could preview this here, and we get our ripple, and maybe we might want to soften this a little bit more, and maybe we'll take down, well, let's just see how that looks. Yes. Yeah, I love that. And maybe what we want to do is maybe keep displace low, like a value of 5 or 6, and then maybe crank up displace spread a little bit more so we get a little bit more of that like tension around there. I love that look. So now as I preview this, there's our EMP going off. You could add your own sound effects, wah, 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 you know, like that kind of thing. So there you have it. And I love this too because of the adjustment layer. We could put our text underneath it like this, and then the displacement ripples through our adjustment layer. And because it's not just a white layer, because there's, you know, all sorts of colors going on, then we get a lot of really interesting chromatic displacement stuff along the edges like that, which is pretty great. Now I want to accentuate this last thing in this composition here. I want to add a flare. So I'm going to turn on my flare layer. It's already set to add. It's just a black solid set to add mode. And I want to add effect, RG, VFX, the VFX Suite, and I'm going to add null light factory, which is like a lens flare solution. It's a lens flare factory for designing custom lens flares and a lot of cool stuff here. So I'm going to go into the designer, this button at the top, and we can see a bunch of different elements here that make up this flare. We can hide these things or solo them if we want to see just what this is doing. And also if I move my mouse over this little arrow thing on the right, we have a bunch of elements that we can add. So I can like double click on this sparkle, for example, and then that adds sparkle to my flare. And maybe I'll add a chroma hoop. So I have a chroma hoop here. And then if I want to fiddle with things, I can select them here, and then I get their options down here at the bottom. So for sparkle, for example, I might take the scale down, just click and drag to the left. To reduce that, well, maybe a little bit more than that. We need some degree of sparkle. You know, we don't want to get rid of our sparkle altogether. So there we have it. Okay, now I'm going to go to my stripe, click on stripe, and I'm going to take down the length a little bit so it's not quite so wide. Yeah, maybe more than that. Yeah, somewhere in that neck of the woods. And I might change the color, change the outer color to something more greenish and mojo friendly. It looks like it's been mojoed. And I'll go ahead and click OK. And I'll go ahead and click the effect control point, put this in the right spot. And I also might want to maybe scale this down, maybe 0.6, a little bit. And then what we have is the behavior area. And there's all these kind of cool automatic behaviors in this dropdown. For example, flicker. So what I can do is, now I preview this, and this is going to flicker this light, which is really cool. Now, basically what I want is I want one little flicker of this lens flare um, to kind of signal that the EMP has detonated. Um, but I don't want to set any keyframes because I'm lazy and I don't want to do any work that I don't have to do. So what I did, and this is like so lazy, it's almost embarrassing. But what I did is I went out and I set this to flicker, and then I just got one flick of brightness, and then I trimmed the endpoint of the layer so that way it seemed like I animated the flare growing, and I didn't. I just set it to automatically flicker and then just like trim the layer so it seems like it gets bigger and smaller, but didn't have to do anything. And I love not doing anything, but still getting results. Okay, so now we're going to move on to some more exciting, fiery things. We're going to talk about SuperComp for the rest of this little session here, which is pretty exciting. And for those of you new to SuperComp, which is the entire planet because SuperComp is a new thing, I'm going to explain SuperComp a little bit, and also even if you know how to use it, we're going to be digging into some cool techniques and tricks here. And every time I play with it, I learn new things about what it can do and see how far I could push it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this, and before I get into a little bit more about what SuperComp does and how it works and blah, 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 I'm going to select the layers that I want to add to SuperComp. And that's pretty much all of my layers except the adjustment layer. And then I'm going to go to Effect, RGF, VFX, and choose SuperComp. This temporarily applies SuperComp to all these layers, then takes it off and makes a new solid and applies all the effects to the solid. We could still fiddle with our layers down here. For example, I could take Mojo and put it on the top so that we could see all of our effects adjusted with Mojo if I want to. And I could take layers, I could move them around, like the text, for example, I could, move it around. But now everything here exists on this Mojo solid. So I could turn off the visibility of all these layers and it doesn't make a difference because everything is in the SuperComp. And so what is SuperComp? It's a little interesting. It took me a minute to wrap my head around what SuperComp is and what it does. I kept wanting to compare it to other things, and I was just really, really wrong a bunch of times. So basically what SuperComp is, it's described by Stu Maschwitz, the creator, who's like this epic visual effects artist. He describes it as an integration engine. So after you've finished all of your work in After Effects, you've done everything that you want to do, and all that's left is to combine finished elements, then that's what we have SuperComp for. SuperComp takes these things and meshes them together because After Effects, bless its sweet little heart, it's an amazing tool. We all love it. We use it all the time. It's super fun to play with. But it doesn't do great at compositing as far as like a really professional workflow because it's layer based. I mean, I love that it's layer based because it's really easy to animate and it makes a lot of sense and stuff when you're doing a lot of motion graphics type things. The layers are great. But when you're compositing, it becomes an obstacle because when we're compositing, we want all the layers to talk to each other. We want them to have a relationship. We want the glows from one layer to rub off on all the other layers and the transparency of layers to rub off on the transparency of other layers. And with layers, you can't get that. You can't do that very well. And so SuperComp creates an environment where you can have that. And it's pretty exciting. So let's talk about this. Now, as I look at my layers in SuperComp, we'll notice something right off the bat. We have one layer that's kind of wacky. What's the deal here? Well, there's three different types of layers in SuperComp. If I click on a layer, I can see the type of layer that it is. There's normal layers, additive layers, and displacement layers. Now, additive layers are great for things like glows and fire, things that are supposed to be bright. And SuperComp intelligently looks at your layers and guesses what the best option is. And so if, like this right here, my layer blend mode was set to add for the fire glow layer, it says, oh, okay, well then you're probably going to want this to be an additive layer. And so it creates an additive layer. And there are different features and functions for additive layers as opposed to normal layers. So if I go to, let's say, the destruction text, and I want to start integrating this into my scene, I could click on this plus icon, and let's add an optical glow. And the optical glow here is very similar to the optical glow that we have just as a standalone effect in After Effects, but it's built in here, and we can use it in our integration engine to have things glow and have that glow interact with everything else. So I'll take this down to maybe like 15 and 15. That's usually like where I start when I'm playing around with optical glow. 15 and 15 seems like a good ballpark for me. But I tone that down, and that's looking pretty decent. Now, the issue here is with the fire. So I'm going to select on the fire, and actually temporarily, I'm just going to turn off the fire glow and the building darken. And let's just focus on this fire for a second. You know, it's hard to get fire to look good. It's difficult to have fire look good because fire is this interesting anomaly visually. Like, it's very, very bright. And so there's tons of exposure when you're recording fire, but also it's kind of opaque. So I could select this layer and put it in the additive mode. And so then it's better in some ways and worse in other ways. So it's more transparent, which is kind of good. It's brighter, which is much better, but now it's just too transparent, which is not good. We need some kind of amalgam of the normal mode opacity and the additive mode exposure. And that's what SuperComp is really excellent at. So as we will see. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start here with the fire, and let's go ahead and add some optical glow to our fire here a little bit. And let me just adjust my notes really quickly here. So I want to actually increase, this feels a little bit bright to me, but we're still going to increase this, and I'll show you why in a second. Because what I want to do is I want to have this glow go out further. So I'm going to increase the size ridiculously. And so now this spread goes out pretty far, and that's pretty awesome. Maybe I could even take this up more if I wanted to. But yeah, see how like this glow is kind of getting everywhere? That's good. But we're still having a problem with the opacity. One of the things that I want to do before we go any further is actually color correct this a little bit. So I'm going to click the plus icon and go to color correction, and I want to adjust the color here. I want to cool this down. This is too warm for this scene. So I'm going to take the temperature down a little bit, cool it off, yeah. And that kind of gets our glow back into like believable levels. And it's starting to look good, but we still just have too much transparency. And so for additive layers, there's this really amazing feature called Core Matte. And this creates something called a holdout matte, which affects the background layer, darkens the background layer, which makes the bright stuff on top pop a little bit more. And so as we increase the grow value in Core Matte, we're increasing the dark areas. So we're basically increasing the opacity. To take this up like ridiculously high, we can see that much more. So here's before the Core Matte, this weak, wimpy, transparent fire with the Core Matte. Ah, yes, it's back in full force, which is really cool. To maybe tone that down just a little bit. As I adjust the erode value, we are bringing transparency back in to some of those edges. So we're basically increasing the contrast of the matte. So I can erode that. I think for this, I'm going to actually have like a smaller erode value. But that's looking pretty decent, pretty good. Now, here's the magic. I'm going to click on the plus icon one more time, and I'm going to add the heat blur. Oh, I love this so much. So it's like a heat distortion effect built into SuperComp, and this is a great way to see how well these layers all integrate together. So I'm going to increase the add texture value, which increases the spread of the pattern. Because basically what's happening here is that SuperComp is going to use the texture of the object itself, in this case the fire. It's going to use that texture to create like a heat distortion map. So that way it's organic, it comes from the source itself. But add texture basically increases the bounds of where this map is. And as it does that, you can increase or alter how it does that. So you can mirror the edges. I'm going to choose fade. That's typically what works best for my experiments with this particular project. But add texture, you don't have to go up too much usually, but it spreads out that displacement. Now we're not seeing anything because I don't have any displacement at all. So the displacement value by default is 0, so you don't really see anything. So I'm going to bump this up, and then as I do, let's take that to like 4-ish. Now we can start to see the heat displacement here. It's very detailed, it's very textured. It probably has a little bit more information than I want it to. So I can soften this a little bit. So like kind of, you know, it dampens that so I don't get as many like fine details. And then I could also do the spread that we saw with chromatic displacement a little bit. Another value that I really like is this confined texture. Because like right now by default, these outer edges are just as detailed as the edges next to the fire. But typically the way heat distortion works, like if you ever like, you know, sat across from somebody in a campfire, the stuff next to the fire has the most displacement, I guess you could say, the most distortion. And then as things get away from the object, it's like the fractal noise pattern used to create the bonfire displacement at the campfire. It like increases in scale, so it's just kind of softer displacement along the edges. And so the confined texture creates that effect where it takes details out of the edges and keeps the detail in the core more. So the more that you increase confined texture, the more the details of the texture are only around the object. Now, to really see what's going on here, I'm going to take the phase 2 destruction text, I'm going to drag it underneath the fire. Now, this doesn't change my layer order here. This only changes my order in SuperComp, which is kind of cool that we have that flexibility here as well. But you can kind of see now what that's doing to my text. It's distorting it, it's messing it up, and it's blending into the fire. And so now I can preview this. You kind of see what's going on here. I love that. So we could go back here and fiddle with the fire a little bit more. I don't think I'm going to take the time to do that because we're going to play with some more super comp stuff in just a moment. But I could turn on the fire glow, and it's a little bright by default. So I'm just going to take the opacity down a bit. Now, one thing to be aware of here is that if I click on, like where you click, that's like really important. So if I click on this part over here, then I'm going to get the layer options. If I click on this little icon, I'm going to get the effect, and I'm going to see the effects options. If I click on like the boundaries of this, like up here at top, I'm going to get options for my entire super comp. So I can add grain here and that type of thing. I can adjust like the output gamma if I want to do that. And I could also adjust the gamma for each layer as well. So I could choose video, log, or linear. So when I'm selecting the layers options, then I could adjust the opacity for the layer itself. And I might want to add maybe this thing, which is a building darken, just like the little darkened layer. I could drag this down here. And maybe take down the opacity of this quite a bit. So we have some kind of like, you know, damage here, and that also makes the bright stuff pop a little bit more. But all in all, I mean, the change here from the default, the change here from the default setting, it's, you know, that's pretty impressive difference that makes. I probably went a little bit too crazy on the add texture value because that heat map is going out there pretty far. So it's looking mildly ridiculous. So I'd probably tone that down if I opened up SuperComp again. But I mean, yeah, it's really tough compositing fire. I love the way that looks. Okay, one last thing, but not the least thing here is that we're going to talk about compositing smoke as well, which is really cool. And I also have my fire and glow and like all of those things. Now, one important thing that that Simon actually taught me, which is pretty cool. I'm actually going to delete this super comp so I can start over again. But one of the things that Simon taught me is that if you have 3D layers, then they should be pre-composed first. So I spent all this time making these like matte paintings and tracked them in. So I have like these like, added some burned, damaged faces to these buildings or whatever. And I track them in, but then if I bring that into SuperComp, it doesn't come over correctly. So I need to pre-compose these. So I can just do pre-comp back. And then I want to collapse the transformations. Pre-comp left and collapse transformations. And now these can be added to SuperComp as well. So what I'm going to do is take all these layers, turn them all on, and I'm going to select them, at least these main ones here, and we're going to go ahead and add this to a new SuperComp. Boom. Awesome. What's also kind of cool too is that I didn't have the particular smoke layer visible when I selected SuperComp, but it automatically turned on the visibility for me, which is really cool. So, and I'm also going to go ahead and drag Mojo over the top so that way we can see a post Mojo view here. I'm going to temporarily turn off the fire and the fire glow and that whole business because like we've already seen that. We might come back to that for our final composite, but for right now, we'll just leave that off. And for the chaos text, I'm going to click plus and then add optical glow as before. And again, we'll use the starting point 1515. And I might take that down a little bit. Might take the size of the glow down. Actually, I think that's kind of cool. I'm going to take the chaos text and put that above the buildings, the damaged buildings, so that we can have yeah, there we go. And I could do some other stuff too that we haven't talked about here. I'm going to click the plus icon, and most of these effects deal with integration. They deal with blending foreground colors into the background colors, or background colors into the foreground colors, or background colors into the foreground edges, and like all that kind of stuff. So anything that you could think of that you'd want to do with blending background into foreground or vice versa, we can pretty much do with these effects. For example, light wrap is a common thing where you're taking colors from the background and wrapping it around the foreground element, which is kind of a cool trick, and it's live and dynamic. So if I were to move this text with the light wrap over a different area with a different background color, then we would have a different light wrap around our text. But our text is glowing and bright, so wrapping light around light is not going to show up at all. But what I can do is do something called a reverse light wrap. So in the same way that light wrap takes colors from the background and changes the edges of the object on the object, reverse light wrap does the exact opposite, where it doesn't touch the object at all, but it takes objects or colors from the edge of the foreground and puts it into the background. So if I increase the amount here, you can kind of see in this preview what's happening. Maybe I'll take this up ridiculously just so you could see. So it's taking the color of the foreground object and spreading it into the background. Because again, sometimes you want foreground color spilling into the background, background color spilling into the foreground, etc. So I'm going to take this down to something a little bit less ridiculous there. Also, I can preview effects on and off with this little switch here. It's a very subtle effect in this case. And a lot of these are very subtle effects, but they would take a long time to set up manually, especially in a layer-based workflow. And so the magic here isn't like, ta-da, look at this one light wrap or reverse light wrap. The magic is that we have all of these tools in this palette to use as we see fit, and they're very quickly and easily applied without a bunch of expressions or linking anything or pre-comps or whatever. They're all just in this beautiful integration engine that is SuperComp. So the glow is coming through our smoke a little bit, but we want to polish this up and make this look even cooler. So I could select my particular smoke layer, and when I have the layer selected, I actually can go to the top here and click on layer presets. And so when I click on layer presets, you can see that we have a bunch of different categories. So we have like, if we have a translucent layer, if we have edges that we're trying to fiddle with because we have like a green screen and we're trying to, get those edges so that they blend, or we have just like something that's just kind of like atmospheric, like a big thing of like fractal noise, mist, or something like that. We could use one of these presets to kind of use as a jumping off point. If I had fire selected, for example, and I'm just gonna turn this on temporarily, and we turn this into an additive layer, what we'd see here that the presets change to be a whole bunch of different types of glows and a whole bunch of different types of like fire. So we can just click on like, big fire or whatever. And then all of these settings are applied automatically. Or we might want to do explosion core or whatever. And we could see that kind of like updating here, which is pretty great. So what I can do here then is go to my particular smoke and try some of these variations. For example, I could try light smoke. And this is actually really, really exciting. Backlit smoke might even be better here. But what this is doing is using an effect called blur behind, which is taking the background layers and blurring that into the object. Now, take a minute, if you will, to appreciate what's happening here. So I have my particular smoke layer on top of my text, and the glow from the text is being sent all through the edges of particular. So right now, if I turn off, let's see, I'll click on my layer here and then just turn off all these effects by this master switch here. So this is the normal particular layer. It's just, smoke on top of text. And there isn't much integration by default. And so I turn on my smoke, and all these settings are there too because of the preset. There's like haze and diffusion and stuff like that too. But some of the blue from the glow of the text is on top of the particular smoke. And this is stuff that you can't do with layers. You can't get this effect with layers without doing a whole bunch of work. But this is dynamic. So I could take this chaos text and I could move it through. And then because it takes its glow with itself, the glow is not glowing this smoke anymore. But it is a little bit. There's still a little bit of that glow getting on this smoke and coming in front of it and behind it and all over it. So this is the magic of SuperComp, where we can take layers and combine them in a dynamic, real, organic way that you just can't do in After Effects. So again, our text is white, but the glow coming from it is this blue color. And that's what's going through our text, just as it would in the real world. If this were really bright white light, or in other words, it was blue light that was so bright that it was just kind of like super white and pure white, then the blue from the glow would just kind of ripple through smoke and atmospheres like this, which is really, really, really cool. And also be aware that SuperComp is a 32-bit environment. So right now we're at regular old 8 bits per channel, so that way our project moves a little bit faster. But SuperComp is kind of like this little sandbox where it is like this self-contained environment, and here the processing operates at 32 bits per channel. So that way we can have our cake and eat it too. We can have like a super powerful light-based workflow with all kinds of integration and HDR, but our project can move along efficiently at 8 bits per channel, which I think is just such a great feature. So I can go here and I can see like the effect here again that's really making this magic is called a blur behind. If I were to take this down to like 30 or something like that, we'd see a much different result. But as I take this up, again, we're taking this layer, the background, the phase 3 chaos layer, and we're blurring it behind the smoke. And if we keep bumping that up, you see we have these variations. It's getting more and more dense, and the blur behind it is getting more and more like spread out, which creates again this kind of like atmospheric effect. If we take it to ridiculous levels, then we get this kind of like smoke, and like this kind of effect where like you're having volumetric smoke, or where what feels like volumetric smoke is just so difficult to create in After Effects because of the whole layer thing. I mean, this looks like light is going through everything, and again, it's totally dynamic. And as we change the layers and change what's behind it, then the smoke is going to update. So, in a nutshell, that is the presentation there. And you can see that again, as the particular smoke is moving around, I love the way that looks, like how organic that looks. That's amazing. So cool. And by the way, this particular smoke, there's nothing particularly special about particular smoke. What I did, in case you're curious, is I just emitted, I have 4 things going on, 4 systems. I have 2 systems in the back, and then I basically duplicated that and put those 2 systems in the foreground here as well. And for each system, it's nothing spectacular. It's a cloudlet as the particle type. So I'm not bringing in like some kind of like trickery or some kind of like video particle or something. This is just the default cloudlet that comes in particular. And then what I do to make smoke is I make semi-dark particles and then just make them really, really big, like the size of 450 here, and very, very transparent. So the opacity is only 6. And so that's my default combination, or at least my starting point for making particular smoke. But again, um, the magic, the takeaway here is the power of using SuperComp for final composites, especially for visual effects or any type of workflow where we want layers to integrate and talk to each other and have their light blend into foreground or background elements or what have you. So again, like just even like that still image, just the way the light just kind of goes on top of the layer above it is so magical to me. So that concludes the like planned portion of this. Of course, I'm around to like answer questions or follow up or more details or whatever if you want to talk about it. But thank you so much for joining us, not only today, but some of you have been around for the last 3 days, and it's been a lot of stuff. It's been a big adventure. So thank you so much for attending. Like this wouldn't have happened without you showing up. So thank you so much for that. And have a great day if you're just taking off. But again, I'm here to answer questions as well. And I'll turn it back over to you, Simon.
That's fantastic stuff, Chad. I mean, this I forgot to mention at the beginning that Chad is not only a member of the Visual Effects Society, but also helps out in the local chapter up in Washington. So, and this is clearly evident because you're using lots of your experience here to explain some of these concepts really well. And that's a tricky one to explain, the reverse light wrap. And that's just such a wonderful example of making something, what did you say yesterday, making it look more expensive than the time you took to make it.
Yeah, I mean,
It's
I think
just
it's
fantastic.
like when you're hired to do stuff, I mean, that's like really the secret. If you could make it seem like, you spent a lot longer on it than you did, that's how you make money.
That's right. Or have extra time for more iterations and changes. Yes, or
Exactly.
both.
Either or.
It's an interesting point also what you said about working in 8-bit like you are in this project, but still getting 32-bit quality out of the effect, because that's what SuperComp is doing. It's got its pipeline in the background. And
Yeah.
that's such a time saver.
Yeah, that is really, really cool. And then because a lot of times, like I might be working on multiple aspects of a similar of one project, and so I might be doing titles in one comp or whatever, but you adjust the bits per channel globally for an entire project. So all compositions have to follow this thing. And so like if I could just go back and keep changing it all the time, but that's an annoyance. And so being able to just like leave this wherever I want it, what works best, and then just have SuperComp be my full 32-bit environment is such a great attribute of SuperComp.
That's a good thing actually to point out, because not only are you getting faster processing, technically all those light rays and all those integration elements and all the blending that's going on is calculated at 32-bit, and then on the fly it's then recalculated back down to 8-bit to match the comp, but you still see the better calculations of how those elements blended originally.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like rendering, right? It's like that's kind of like what happens on the render is that it like
Yeah,
shrinks back down to 8 bits per channel, but it still has the same look because the processing is really the magic of the 32-bit. It's like the computation, and that's what also takes the hit. So Super Comp does that and does it really fast. Yeah, I love that.
it's also nice how you've used particular with that cloudlet particle, which is the real secret, of course, about making smoke and mist and steam. And also, it's not using a custom sprite, so it's faster to render because it's using the inbuilt cloudlet sprite from particular. But it
I didn't realize that
reminded
that was
me,
faster. Interesting.
oh yes, what you can do, it is faster because the actual sprites don't need to be loaded into RAM before they're screen blitted onto the comp. So it actually is technically it's a faster process.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
And it's fun too, also, that thing you mentioned yesterday about switching over to GPU processing in both form and particular, because cloudlet particles are something that really benefit from that GPU processing because of the way they blend with each other to form this fake smoke, if you like.
Hmm.
But what I was going to say is that two things really. One is you've raised that subject of being able to customize your smoke, so that apart from not having to buy stock library smoke, also if you find that situation where, whenever I've searched for stock library smoke, I can't quite get the right bit, so I'm cropping out and masking or duplicating and spending a lot of time getting the perfect smoke, whereas in particular, in this case, you've got very quickly, you can get the exact area and the volume, and then you can control it. So that's one aspect. That's a happy side effect of using particular. But the other thing
Yeah.
about processing more quickly, I would say, is that if I've seen a lot of people using SuperComp and doing compositing on laptops and on lower power desktops. So if
Hmm.
you're doing that and particular is processing at the same time that you're doing comping, a nice little trick is to pre-comp or do a comp proxy. So you could do pre-comp that one particular element, and then you've got a proxy render of the smoke, and then it makes the scrubbing on lower power machines much faster.
Oh, awesome. That's a great tip.
So yeah, it's just something that's come up a bit recently. I think everyone's been waiting to see which particular flavor of machine they're updating to. Certainly the Mac users have. But
Hmm.
still, it's the same if you're on Windows 2. It's the same GPU processing you get inside SuperComp 2.
Hmm.
But it's it's always fun to talk about the technical stuff in the background, but it does make the creative aspects a bit easier too.
Yeah.
And talking of creative, that was just going back to what you were showing earlier on. I love that use of the radio waves, which, as you said, have been around since last century, of course.
Yes.
And yes, and it's also then applying Ecto, which picks up any alpha channel. It doesn't have to be the alpha channel of text, as you so rightfully demonstrated there. It can be the circle, the alpha channel of that radio wave effect. And then suddenly you got something which looks like it's a procedural electricity style effect really cheaply, and then configuring it. So that's another trick I'm going to steal from you and use that, because
Yeah,
yes, that's just such a fantastic thing.
yeah, it was so fun. It's like no matter what I was doing when I was playing with this, it's like you kind of can't make something that looks dumb. Like everything that you're doing, it's just like, oh, it's actually pretty cool. And it probably looks even cooler when it's not on a gray solid. So yeah, that's very, very cool. And I love the distortion too because you instantly apply it to like any regular layer. I mean, this is just like before and after. Like this is radio waves, and then with Ecto. I mean, it's a pretty big difference, you know?
Yeah, see, you almost don't want to do this in front of the client or producer, do you? They don't want to see it's that quick to do. No, this took
Yes.
me ages to do.
Yeah, it's so long.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again, Chad. This has been fantastic, really great. Some fantastic, useful, creative, pragmatic tips that you can use straight away as well. That's what I like about each of these steps. You've broken them down into individual items, which you can use as a whole as you have shown here, but also you can borrow bits and then augment different designs with these same concepts. So that's brilliant. Thank you.
Very cool. Thank you so much.
And for everyone watching, thank you for being with us for today and for the other days as well. You'll get the recording shortly, but if you don't, or if you'd like to ask any follow-up questions, please let us know, or please contact us at training@redgiant.com, and we'd be delighted to hear from you. And also, if you've got any suggestions about future webinars and what you'd like to see, or any concepts you'd like to see, then let us know too, and we'll add those into the schedule, and you should see some more of these in the next few weeks. We're going to send out some more invitations for another series too. But thanks again, and once again, thank you, Chad. Really appreciate your sharing your knowledge, and see you all on the next one of these.
Awesome. Have a good one, everybody.
All right, thank you.
Take care.